"You're a walking embarrassment to this family. This dress costs $4.50 at a thrift store, but the shame you bring us is priceless." Those words, spat with a venom that only a sister can harbor, still ring in my ears with the clarity of a church bell on a silent Sunday morning. I watched, paralyzed, as my sister's manicured fingers, tipped with a $40 gel manicure in the shade OPI Big Apple Red, flicked a silver Zippo lighter. The flame caught the edge of my favorite 1950s vintage silk blouse, a piece I had painstakingly restored by hand with a bone needle and Gutermann silk thread. I remember the scent most of all, the acrid, chemical stench of Kingsford charcoal lighter fluid mingling with the heartbreaking smell of burning historical silk. The metal trash can in our driveway hummed with the heat of the fire, a localized inferno that consumed the only thing that made me feel beautiful. My name is Cassidy Miller. I am 29 years old, and today I am the lead textile engineer for a global luxury conglomerate, overseeing fabric development for brands that the average person only sees in the glossy pages of Vogue. I spent my morning analyzing the tensile strength of a new carbon fiber-infused wool blend in a laboratory that costs $3 million a year to maintain. But to my family, sitting in their sprawling 5-bedroom colonial home in the affluent suburbs of Greenwich, Connecticut, I was always nothing more than the garbage girl. The contrast between who I am now and who they forced me to be is a chasm wider than the Atlantic. My sister Vanessa was the golden child, a woman who measured her worth in the weight of her Tiffany bracelets and the prestige of her social circle. Growing up in a house where the 2024 Mercedes-Benz S-Class in the driveway was washed every Tuesday and Friday regardless of the weather, my obsession with the old, the worn, and the discarded was seen as a mental illness rather than a passion. My father, a high-level hedge fund manager who tracked the S&P 500 with the fervor of a religious zealot, viewed my interest in textiles as a personal affront to his legacy. He wanted a daughter who would marry a partner at Goldman Sachs, not one who spent her weekends in the dusty basements of estate sales in rural Pennsylvania, looking for scraps of Victorian lace or forgotten mid-century patterns. But I am getting ahead of myself. Now, let me take you back to that humid July afternoon 10 years ago, the day the last thread of my patience finally snapped. It was the day of my parents' silver wedding anniversary gala, an event that had been planned for 18 months with a budget exceeding $200,000. The catering alone, handled by a firm out of Manhattan, cost $60,000, featuring beluga caviar served on mother-of-pearl spoons and vintage 2004 Dom Perignon that flowed like water. I had spent 6 months preparing for that night, not by shopping at Bergdorf Goodman like Vanessa, but by recreating a gown from a 1947 Parisian sketch I found in an attic. I had sourced the fabric from a defunct textile mill in Massachusetts, a heavy, cream-colored satin that felt like liquid moonlight. I spent 400 hours on the embroidery, using microscopic glass beads I'd salvaged from a broken flapper dress. I felt like a masterpiece. But when I walked down the grand mahogany staircase of our home, my mother didn't see the craftsmanship. She didn't see the technical precision of the French seams or the way the bias cut draped perfectly over my frame. She saw a dead woman's clothes. She saw a daughter who refused to fit the mold of a Greenwich socialite. Vanessa had been waiting at the bottom of the stairs, wearing a $6,000 Versace gown that she had bought on a whim during a trip to Milan. The fabric was a synthetic blend that made my skin crawl just looking at it, but to my parents, the price tag was the only thing that gave it value. When she saw me, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. She reached out and grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin right above the elbow, and dragged me toward the mudroom. My parents followed, their silence more deafening than any shout could have been. They watched as she pulled the vintage blouse I was wearing underneath my wrap, a piece I had intended to change out of once the formal photos were taken, and began the ritual of destruction. That blouse was a 1954 Christian Dior original, a piece of fashion history that belonged in a museum. But to Vanessa, it was just more of Cassidy's trash. As the silk turned to black ash in that metal can, I realized that my family didn't just hate my clothes. They hated my autonomy. They hated that I could find beauty in things they deemed worthless. They hated that I didn't need their platinum Amex cards to feel significant. My father stepped forward, his leather loafers clicking on the concrete of the driveway, a sound that usually signaled an impending lecture on fiscal responsibility. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather wallet, extracting a crisp $100 bill. He dropped it onto the ground next to the burning trash can. "Buy something that doesn't smell like a funeral home, Cassidy," he said, his voice cold and devoid of any fatherly warmth. He didn't even look at me as he turned and walked back into the house to greet the guests who were starting to arrive in their Audis and Range Rovers. The injustice of that moment sat in my chest like a lead weight. I was a straight-A student. I had a scholarship waiting for me at the Rhode Island School of Design, and I had never once asked them for a dime for my hobby. I worked 20 hours a week at a local dry cleaner, learning the chemistry of solvents and the delicate art of stain removal, just to afford my sewing supplies. I was the one who stayed up until 3 a.m. studying organic chemistry so I could understand the molecular structure of synthetic polymers, while Vanessa was out spending $500 on bottle service at clubs she wasn't even old enough to enter. Yet, I was the disappointment. I was the one they hid in the kitchen when the neighbors came over. I was the one whose name was left off the holiday cards because my aesthetic didn't match the family brand. I stood there for a long time after they left, the heat from the trash can warming my face while the rest of my body felt ice cold. The smell of the lighter fluid was nauseating, a sharp, oily scent that seemed to coat the back of my throat. I looked down at the $100 bill sitting in the oil-stained driveway. It was a pittance to them, a rounding error in their monthly budget, but to me, it was the final payment on my debt to this family. I didn't pick it up. I left it there, a bright green rectangle against the gray pavement, and walked to my car, a rusted 2008 Honda Civic that I had bought with my own savings and maintained with my own hands. The engine turned over with a rough mechanical groan, a sound of pure reality in a world of polished veneers. As I drove away from that house, passing the manicured lawns and the security gates of our neighbors, I felt a strange sense of liberation. They thought they were burning my clothes, but they were actually burning the bridge that connected me to their expectations. Every mile I put between myself and Greenwich was a mile closer to the person I was meant to be. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent deconstructing old garments, learning how the warp and weft of a fabric could tell a story of a time long gone. I realized then that my ability to see value where others saw waste was my greatest strength, a superpower they could never understand because they were too busy looking at the labels. The technical world of textiles became my sanctuary. People think fashion is just about sketches and runways, but it is a world of rigorous science. I spent my early 20s in laboratories, surrounded by the hum of spectrophotometers and the rhythmic clicking of computerized looms. I learned how to manipulate the molecular chains of polyester to create fabrics that breathed like cotton, and how to harvest silk in a way that didn't harm the moth. I became an expert in the historical preservation of ancient tapestries, working with institutions that valued my eyes and my hands more than my pedigree. While Vanessa was navigating her third divorce and complaining about the cost of maintaining her lifestyle in a penthouse that my father paid for, I was filing patents for sustainable fiber technologies that would eventually revolutionize the industry. I remember the first time I earned a six-figure bonus. It wasn't just the money. It was the realization that my garbage girl skills were now worth more than my father's hedge fund's quarterly earnings in certain sectors. I bought myself a 2024 Porsche Taycan in a custom shade of deep sea blue, a car that represented the pinnacle of engineering and design. I didn't buy it for the status. I bought it because the interior featured a revolutionary recycled textile that I had helped develop. Every time I ran my hand over the seat, I felt the ghost of that 1954 Dior blouse. I had taken the ash of my past and spun it into a future they couldn't even imagine. Family isn't blood, and it certainly isn't a shared last name or a matching set of luggage. Family is the people who see the genius in your obsession and the beauty in your scars. My family spent 29 years trying to weave a narrative where I was the flaw in the fabric, the loose thread that needed to be trimmed away. But what they didn't realize is that the loose thread is often the only thing holding the whole garment together. Without me to look down upon, the internal rot of the Miller family began to show. They had spent so long focusing on my perceived poverty that they didn't notice their own spiritual bankruptcy. As I sit in my office today, overlooking the skyline of Paris, I am no longer the girl in the driveway. I am the architect of my own life, and the fabric of my reality is stronger than anything they could ever hope to tear apart. The shame they tried to give me never belonged to me. It was theirs all along, hidden behind their designer labels and their expensive smiles. And now, finally, the truth has a way of coming out, one thread at a time. Growing up in our 3,200-square-foot colonial home in the pristine enclave of Scarsdale, New York, I learned very early that the texture of one's life was measured solely by the sharpness of the creases in my father's trousers and the lack of weeds in our driveway. My father, Marcus Miller, was a senior partner at a top-tier law firm in Manhattan where he billed $750 an hour to tell wealthy men how to keep their wealth. And he brought that same cold, litigious energy home every night at exactly 6:45 p.m. To him and my mother, Evelyn, the world was a stage where the audience was always judging, and every detail of our existence had to be curated to project an image of effortless, upper-middle-class perfection. They spent $8,400 a year just on professional lawn maintenance, ensuring that the Kentucky bluegrass was cut to a uniform 3 inches and that the edges of the flower beds were as sharp as a surgical scalpel, all to impress neighbors whose names they barely bothered to remember. In this house of polished mahogany and forced smiles, my older sister Brianna was the undisputed protagonist of the family narrative. Now 32 and still draped in the unearned arrogance of the favored, Brianna was the golden child for whom no expense was ever too great and no whim was ever ignored. I remember her 16th birthday clearly, a $45,000 Sweet 16 gala at a private club where the floral arrangements alone cost more than most people's annual rent, and she walked out to find a brand-new white BMW 3 Series wrapped in a red bow waiting for her in the valet circle. She moved through the world in a rotating wardrobe of exclusively Lululemon and Aritzia, her yoga pants costing more than my entire bedroom's worth of furniture, while I was treated as an afterthought, a background character in the story of her success. While Brianna was being chauffeured to private tennis lessons and gifted international vacations for simply existing, I was given a $20 weekly allowance and told with a condescending pat on the shoulder to make it work. My parents viewed my lack of interest in the high-stakes social climbing of Scarsdale as a character flaw, a sign that I lacked the ambition they so highly prized in Brianna. But in reality, I was building a world they were too blind to see. Every Saturday morning, while the rest of the house was still asleep, I would slip out of the back door and drive my beat-up bicycle to the outskirts of town, where the charity shops and dusty basements of thrift stores offered a sanctuary from the sterile perfection of my home. I spent my weekends knee-deep in bins of discarded fabrics, smelling the metallic scent of old zippers and the faint, sweet musk of cedar chests, searching for the hidden treasures that the wealthy residents of Westchester County had deemed obsolete. I became an expert at identifying the weight of genuine silk versus the slick, cheap feel of polyester, and I would spend my meager allowance on stained vintage slips or torn evening gowns that were priced at $2 because the volunteers at the shop didn't recognize the value of a hand-rolled hem or a genuine silk organza. I brought these relics back to my room, which felt like a secret laboratory tucked away in the attic of a museum, and I began the painstaking process of teaching myself the language of construction. My primary tool was a $15 Singer sewing machine from 1974, a heavy cast-iron beast with a motor that hummed with a low mechanical growl that sounded like a promise of something real. It didn't have the computerized stitches or the sleek plastic casing of a modern machine, but it had the strength to pierce through 6 layers of denim and the precision to handle the most delicate lace. I spent thousands of hours hunched over that machine, the light from a single desk lamp illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air as I took apart the garments I had bought and studied the way they were built. I learned how a designer in the 30s would use a bias cut to make a dress cling to a woman's curves without a single zipper, and I practiced my top stitching until every line was as straight as the rows of boxwood in our front yard. My hands were often stained with the dyes I used to refresh faded fabrics, and my fingertips were calloused from the thousands of times I accidentally pricked myself with a needle. But I didn't mind the pain, because it felt like I was earning my place in the world. While Brianna was scrolling through social media or arguing with my mother about which designer bag she needed for the upcoming spring formal, I was lost in the tactile reality of the warp and weft of the world. I would find a silk scarf with a small cigarette burn and spend an entire Sunday morning reweaving the fibers until the flaw was invisible to the naked eye, a skill that required the patience of a saint and the precision of a watchmaker. My parents would occasionally look into my room and see the piles of fabric and the prehistoric sewing machine and sigh with a mixture of pity and embarrassment, as if my hobby was a dirty secret they had to hide from the neighbors. They didn't understand that while they were paying thousands of dollars to maintain the illusion of a perfect life, I was learning how to actually build one from the ground up, one stitch at a time. The contrast between my sister's life of luxury and my life of labor was a constant, underlying tension that defined the Miller household. Brianna's BMW sat in the driveway like a trophy, its leather interior smelling of expensive perfume and latte foam, while I was carefully measuring out the $3.50 I needed for a spool of high-quality Gutermann thread. She would come home with shopping bags from the Westchester Mall, tossing $100 sweaters onto her bed with a careless disregard, while I was soaking a piece of Victorian lace in a solution of distilled water and gentle soap to remove a century of grime. My mother would often comment on how tired I looked at the dinner table, her eyes scanning my clothes for any sign of the second-hand origins she so loathed. "Cassidy, you really should let Brianna take you to the mall," she would say, her voice dripping with a feigned concern that was actually a thin veil for her shame. "It's not healthy for a girl your age to be spending all her time with old rags and a machine that belongs in a scrapyard." I would just nod and continue eating my dinner, knowing that the rags she disparaged were actually high-quality natural fibers that would outlast her synthetic blends by 50 years. I knew the molecular difference between the cellulose fibers in linen and the protein fibers in wool, a level of technical knowledge that my father, the great attorney, would never bother to acquire about anything he couldn't bill for. There was a specific kind of injustice in the way they treated my labor. When Brianna managed to get a B in her college prep courses, my father would celebrate by taking the family out to a $500 steakhouse dinner. But when I completed a fully lined, tailored coat from scratch using fabric I had salvaged from a discarded sofa cover, they didn't even notice. To them, my creations were just more clutter in their perfectly curated house. I remember one evening when I tried to show my father a complex embroidery pattern I had designed, a motif inspired by the neural pathways of the human brain executed in silver metallic thread. He glanced at it for 3 seconds before shifting his gaze back to his iPad to check the latest legal briefs. "That's nice, Cassidy, but shouldn't you be focusing on your SAT prep? You know the neighbor's daughter just got into Yale." The message was clear. My value was only relevant if it could be measured against the benchmarks of the Scarsdale elite. My passion for engineering and materials was a distraction from the only thing that mattered to them, which was the social standing of the Miller name. They wanted a daughter who was a polished accessory, not a girl with thread under her fingernails and a mind full of chemical formulas for fabric treatments. I grew up in the shadows of their expectations, developing a quiet resilience that was as tough as the industrial canvas I loved to work with. I realized that the luxury they surrounded themselves with was fragile, a thin veneer of wealth that relied on the approval of others, whereas my skills were portable and permanent. I didn't need their permission to be an engineer, and I didn't need their money to create something of value. I was learning the physics of tension and the chemistry of color in a way that no expensive private tutor could ever teach. Every time I stepped into one of those dusty charity shop basements, I wasn't just looking for cheap silk. I was looking for the raw materials of my escape. I was collecting the pieces of a future where I wouldn't have to apologize for the scent of a thrift store or the sound of an old sewing machine. I knew that one day the garbage girl would be the one holding the keys to a world they couldn't even enter, a world where quality was measured by the integrity of the weave rather than the price on the tag. But back then, in the quiet, manicured streets of Scarsdale, I was just the girl with the $20 allowance dreaming of the day I could finally set fire to their expectations and walk away into a life of my own making. A life that was as authentic and enduring as the vintage silk I held so tightly in my hands. The silence of my parents' disapproval was the soundtrack to my education, and every stitch I took was a silent rebellion against the superficiality of the Miller legacy. I was becoming the textile engineer I am today, not because of their support, but in spite of their neglect, turning their indifference into the fuel that would eventually propel me to the top of a global industry they could only dream of influencing. In that 3,200 square foot house, I was the only thing that wasn't for sale, the only part of the image that was truly, undeniably real. The definitive breaking point of my life occurred on June 14th at exactly 6:45 p.m., a moment etched into my memory with the agonizing precision of a needle piercing through heavy denim. The setting was the Pelham Country Club, an establishment that breathed old money and exclusion, where the air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and the salt spray of the Long Island Sound. It was my sister Brianna's engagement party, an event my father had financed with the casual indifference of a man who viewed a $12,300 bill as mere pocket change. The ballroom was a sea of pastel silks and expensive perfumes, decorated with white hydrangeas that cost $300 per arrangement, all designed to celebrate Brianna's union with a man whose family pedigree was as impeccable as his teeth. I had arrived not in a designer gown purchased from a boutique on Madison Avenue, but in a dress that was the culmination of 40 hours of grueling, solitary labor. I had spent weeks in my cramped attic room, hand-stitching every seam of a gown I'd constructed from recycled champagne-colored satin that I had salvaged from a discarded 1990s bridal overflow lot. To the untrained eye, it was just a dress, but to me, it was a masterpiece of structural engineering, featuring a complex internal corset and hand-rolled hems that were practically invisible to the naked eye. As I walked through the heavy oak doors of the club, I knew that my creation, which had cost me less than $15 in materials, looked significantly more sophisticated and technologically superior to Brianna's $2,000 Vera Wang off-the-rack slip. The tension in the room shifted the moment I stepped into the light of the crystal chandeliers, the guests pausing their conversations about interest rates and summer rentals to stare at the girl they usually ignored. I could see the realization dawning on Brianna's face, a slow burn of recognition that her younger, discarded sister had managed to upstage her on her own night using nothing but scraps and skill. She stood there by the tiered cake, clutching a glass of vintage Veuve Clicquot that retailed for $180 a bottle, her eyes narrowing as she took in the perfect drape of my satin and the way the light caught the meticulous embroidery on my bodice. It wasn't just about the beauty of the dress. It was about the fact that I had created something of immense value without the help of my father's bank account, a direct challenge to the hierarchy they had worked so hard to maintain. In a fit of calculated theatrical rage disguised as clumsiness, Brianna began to move toward me, her face a mask of false sweetness that didn't reach her eyes. She feigned a stumble over the plush wool carpeting, and I watched in slow motion as the golden, bubbling liquid of the champagne left her glass, arching through the air before soaking into the back of my dress, the cold moisture seeping through the fibers of the silk and chilling my skin. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of an unspoken agreement among the elite members of the club. No one rushed to offer a napkin or a word of comfort. Instead, They watched with a detached curiosity, as if witnessing a minor spill on a sidewalk rather than the destruction of a human being's dignity. I felt the weight of the wet satin pulling at my shoulders, the expensive alcohol ruining the delicate finish of the fabric I had spent so many late nights polishing. My mother, Evelyn, didn't look at Brianna with reproach or demand an apology for her behavior. Instead, she moved toward me with a sharp, bird-like intensity, her heels clicking rhythmically on the parquet floor. She reached out, not to touch my hand, but to pull me into the shadows of a nearby alcove, her face contorted in a sneer of pure social desperation. She leaned in so close I could smell the gin on her breath and the cloying sweetness of her Chanel No. 5 perfume as she whispered words that acted as the final blow to my connection with the Miller family. "Go change into the waitress's spare uniform in the locker room, Cassidy," she hissed, her voice vibrating with a cold, jagged edge. "You look like a drowned rat and you're ruining the aesthetic of the professional photos." That sentence was the catalyst that finally dissolved the molecular bonds of my loyalty to a family that viewed me as a prop rather than a person. In her mind, the integrity of a high-resolution photograph was worth more than my self-worth, and the shame of having a daughter in a wet dress was greater than the shame of a daughter being humiliated by her own sister. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the hollowness behind her carefully applied Lancome foundation and her permanent scowl of dissatisfaction. I realized then that I had been trying to sew a relationship out of rotten thread, and no amount of effort or precision could ever make it hold. I didn't argue, I didn't cry, and I certainly didn't go to the locker room to put on a polyester uniform to serve the people who had spent my entire life starving me of affection. I turned on my heel, the wet satin of my dress heavy and cold against my spine, and walked out of the Pelham Country Club without uttering a single word. I walked past the valet stand where the 2024 BMWs and Lexuses were lined up like shiny toys, and I kept walking until I reached the edge of the property where the streetlights began. I reached into the small, hidden pocket I had sewn into the lining of my dress, a secret compartment for emergencies, and found exactly $4.12 in loose change and crumpled singles. It was a pathetic sum, a fraction of what a single appetizer at the party cost, but it was entirely mine, earned from returning aluminum cans I had found in the park and selling small fabric scraps to local quilters. With that meager amount of capital and the clothes on my back, I walked toward the local train station, the humid New York night air beginning to dry the champagne on my skin, leaving behind a sticky, sickly sweet residue. I sat on the hard plastic bench of the Metro North platform, watching the moths dance around the fluorescent lights, and I felt a sense of clarity that I had never experienced in the 3,200-square-foot house in Scarsdale. The Miller family, with their $8,400 lawns and their senior partnerships and their white BMWs, no longer had any power over the composition of my soul. I was leaving behind the world of high-end appearances and entering the world of raw, unfiltered reality, where the only thing that mattered was what you could build with your own two hands. I boarded the late-night train heading toward the city, the rhythmic clanking of the wheels on the track sounding like a mechanical heartbeat that was synchronized with my own. I looked at my reflection in the dark window of the train car and saw a woman who was finally, irrevocably free from the burden of being a disappointment. The $4.12 in my hand felt heavier and more significant than any allowance I had ever received, because it represented the start of a life where I would never again have to ask for permission to exist. I didn't know where I was going to sleep that night, or how I would afford a meal the next day, but I knew with a technical certainty that I possessed a set of skills that the world needed. I understood the chemistry of polymers, the physics of tension, and the artistry of construction, and those were things that no one could spill champagne on or dismiss as garbage. I was Cassidy Miller, and as the train pulled away from the station, leaving the Pelham Country Club and its $12,300 party in the dust, I felt the first threads of my new life beginning to weave themselves together into something resilient, something authentic, and something that would eventually become a global empire. I left behind the girl who was told she was an embarrassment, and in her place was an engineer who knew that the strongest fabrics are often forged under the greatest heat and pressure. The journey from that train station to the lead textile lab of a luxury conglomerate was long and paved with hardship, but it began with that single, defiant step away from a family that valued photos over feelings. I was no longer the garbage girl. I was the architect of a future that would make their Scarsdale Colonial look like a dollhouse made of cardboard. And as I looked out at the passing lights of the Bronx, I knew that the real story of my life was only just beginning, and this time I was the one holding the needle. I didn't need a golden child's inheritance because I had the ability to spin gold out of the very discarded things they were too arrogant to value. The $4.12 in my pocket was the seed of a fortune they would never be able to touch, a fortune built on the integrity of labor rather than the accident of birth. I was finished with their narratives, finished with their fake smiles, and finished with being the background character in Brianna's manufactured life. From that night on, every stitch I made was for myself, and every success I achieved was a testament to the fact that you can burn the clothes, but you can never destroy the hands that made them. The engine of the train hummed with a low, vibrating power that mirrored the resolve in my chest. And for the first time in 29 years, I breathed in air that didn't smell like charcoal lighter fluid or judgment. I was free, and the cost of that freedom was exactly $4.12 and a ruined satin dress, a price I would have paid 1,000 times over to finally see the truth. I spent the remainder of that pivotal night huddled in a 24-hour Dunkin' Donuts off Flatbush Avenue, seeking refuge from the biting humidity of the New York night behind a window stained with the grime of 1,000 passing commutes. The interior was lit by flickering fluorescent tubes that cast a sickly, clinical blue hue over the room, and I sat at a sticky orange plastic table that smelled faintly of sour milk and industrial-strength floor cleaner. The rhythmic humming of the industrial refrigerator in the corner was the only soundtrack to my displacement, a stark contrast to the refined string quartet that had been playing at the Pelham Country Club only hours before. My gown, the cream-colored satin masterpiece that had been the physical manifestation of my soul, was now ruined, the back stiffening as the sugars in the $180 Veuve Clicquot champagne dried into the fibers, creating a jagged amber stain that looked like a map of a country I no longer inhabited. I reached for a stack of thin, low-quality paper napkins from a plastic dispenser and pulled a black Bic ballpoint pen from the depths of my bag, my fingers trembling slightly, not from fear but from the raw, kinetic energy of a total systemic collapse. With the precision of an engineer drafting a schematic, I drew a vertical line down the center of the first napkin, creating a grid that would serve as the foundational document for the rest of my life. On the left side, I wrote the heading Family Expectations in cramped, sharp letters, and on the right, I wrote my talent, and then I began the cold, mathematical process of auditing my own existence. Under the column of Family Expectations, I listed everything Marcus and Evelyn Miller had ever required of me: silence, obedience, a prestigious marriage, a carbon copy of Brianna's superficial success, and the total erasure of my own intellectual interests. As I looked at the list, I realized with a jarring clarity that the total value of that column was zero. It offered no security, no equity, and no future that didn't involve me slowly suffocating under the weight of their judgment. I then turned my attention to the My Talent column, and I began to catalog the technical assets I had accumulated in the shadows of their Scarsdale Colonial. I wrote down my ability to identify textile blends by touch alone, my mastery of complex pattern drafting, my self-taught knowledge of chemical dye stabilization, and the 40 hours of manual labor I could invest in a single garment without breaking my focus. I quantified my worth not in the eyes of the Scarsdale elite, but in the raw market value of high-end craftsmanship and engineering. I realized then that while my family's approval was a fluctuating currency controlled by people who didn't love me, my talent was a hard asset that no one could seize. This was the moment I truly understood that the old adage about blood being thicker than water was a lie designed to keep the oppressed in line. Blood is nothing more than biology, a sequence of 4 nucleobases that dictates your hair color but has absolutely no bearing on your character or your destiny. Facts do not lie, and the cold, hard fact of my life was that I was significantly better off as an orphan than as a Miller, because an orphan is at least free from the debt of gratitude for a life of systematic belittlement. The reality of my situation began to take shape as I calculated the cost of survival in a city that demands a high price for the privilege of being ignored. I knew that a $1,200 a month studio apartment in a rough, ungentrified part of Brooklyn was the bare minimum I would need to establish a base of operations, a place where I could set up my 1974 Singer machine and work until my eyes burned. To my father, $1,200 was a single dinner at Sparks Steakhouse, a line item he would barely notice on his monthly statement. But to me, it was the price of my soul's autonomy. I looked at the napkins spread out on the sticky table, the ink from my ballpoint pen bleeding into the cheap paper, and I saw a blueprint for a revolution. I wasn't just planning a career, I was planning a total reconstruction of my identity from the molecular level up. I spent the next 4 hours as the sun began to rise over the city, turning the sky a bruised shade of purple and orange, calculating the number of hours I would need to work at a commercial upholstery shop or a garment repair center to meet my overhead. I didn't feel despair. I felt a profound sense of technical alignment, as if the warp and weft of my life were finally being pulled into the correct tension. The shame of being the garbage girl evaporated in the heat of my new ambition, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve that would eventually propel me into the boardrooms of global luxury conglomerates. Every person who walked into that Dunkin' Donuts in the early hours of the morning, from the weary night shift nurses to the construction workers in their fluorescent vests, was a witness to the birth of the lead textile engineer I would become. They saw a girl in a ruined satin dress frantically writing on napkins, but I saw a woman who was finally speaking the truth to herself. I realized that my parents' $8,400 lawn maintenance budget was a monument to their own insecurity, a desperate attempt to keep the chaos of their internal lives at bay by manicuring the external world. I, on the other hand, was embracing the chaos, using it as the raw material for a new kind of strength. I knew that the path ahead would be grueling, that I would likely spend months eating 50-cent ramen and sleeping on a thin mattress on a hardwood floor, but I welcomed the hardship because it was honest. There is a specific kind of peace that comes from knowing you have reached rock bottom and found that the floor is made of solid stone rather than shifting sand. I wasn't a disappointment. I was a high-performance material that had been incorrectly categorized by people who didn't understand the specifications. As the morning light grew stronger, reflecting off the stainless steel coffee urns and the glaze on the racks of donuts, I stood up and gathered my napkins, folding them carefully and placing them in my bag like they were sacred scrolls. I walked out of the store and into the cool morning air, the sound of the city waking up around me like a great mechanical beast. The smell of exhaust and roasting coffee was better than any perfume Evelyn Miller had ever worn, because it was the smell of a world that didn't care about my pedigree, only about what I could produce. I headed toward the nearest subway station, the $4.12 in my pocket, a tiny but potent seed of capital. I knew that the journey to a $1,200 studio in Brooklyn would be the hardest thing I had ever done, but I also knew that the technical precision I had honed in my Scarsdale attic would be my greatest weapon. My family thought they had discarded me like a piece of vintage trash, but they had actually released me into my natural habitat. I began to see my life as a series of engineering problems to be solved rather than a series of emotional wounds to be healed. The first problem was shelter, the second was equipment, and the third was market penetration. I walked with a new kind of purpose, my heels clicking on the sidewalk with a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. I thought about Brianna and the $45,000 Sweet 16 that had purchased her nothing but a life of hollow luxury, and I felt a surge of genuine pity for her. She was a passenger in her own life, whereas I was now the pilot of mine. The contrast between her white BMW and the rusted subway cars I was about to enter was stark, but I knew which vehicle was taking me toward a real future. My father's law firm could sue the world for every penny it was worth, but they could never litigate the talent out of my fingertips or the resilience out of my spirit. I was a miller by blood, but I was a textile engineer by choice, and from that morning forward, the choice was the only thing that mattered. The grid on the napkins remained in my mind as a permanent internal compass, a constant reminder that my value was intrinsic and measurable. Whenever I would later face a setback in the industry, whenever a design was rejected or a fabric failed a stress test, I would return to the mental image of that sticky plastic table in Brooklyn. I would remember the feeling of the dry champagne on my back and the $4.12 in my pocket, and I would realize that there was no obstacle I couldn't deconstruct and reassemble into a victory. My family had tried to use me as a canvas for their own failures, but I had turned myself into the architect of their irrelevance. The truth was that I didn't need their inheritance because I was the only true creator they had ever produced. They were managers of appearances, but I was a builder of substance. As the Q train rumbled over the Manhattan Bridge, giving me a sweeping view of the skyline that I would one day influence, I whispered a silent thank you to the sister who spilled the champagne and the mother who told me to change into a uniform. They had given me the greatest gift of all, the realization that I was entirely, beautifully, and powerfully alone. By the time I reached the street level in Brooklyn, the sun was fully up, glinting off the windows of the brownstones and the industrial warehouses. The air was thick with the energy of millions of people striving for something better, and for the first time in 29 years, I was one of them. I wasn't the garbage girl hiding in an attic. I was a woman on a mission to prove that quality is the only thing that survives the fire. I looked at the people passing by, each of them wrapped in fabrics that I could analyze down to the fiber, and I felt a deep, abiding connection to the world around me. I was no longer a misfit in a Scarsdale colonial. I was a vital component of a global machine. The $1,200 a month studio was just the first step in a long staircase that would lead me to the very top of the fashion world, and I intended to climb every single inch of it with my head held high. My life was no longer a story of shame. It was a story of engineering excellence, and the first chapter was written in ballpoint pen on a Dunkin' Donuts napkin. I was free, I was capable, and for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I knew that family isn't something you are born into. It is something you build with the people who value your work, your mind, and your integrity. And as I walked deeper into the heart of Brooklyn, I began the work of building a family of my own making, one stitch, one fiber, and one fact at a time. The next 7 years of my life were a relentless, high-velocity blur of 18-hour days and nights that bled into one another. A period defined by the rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat of my sewing machine and the flickering blue light of a laptop screen as I pursued a degree in materials science. I began this odyssey in that drafty, $1,200 a month studio in the industrial edges of Brooklyn, where the walls were thin enough to hear the neighbors' televisions and the radiator hissed like a cornered animal throughout the long New York winters. To keep the lights on and my tuition paid, I worked as a freelance seamstress, taking on the intricate repair jobs that the high-end dry cleaners on the Upper East Side were too afraid to touch. I spent my mornings hunched over delicate silks and moth-eaten cashmeres, using needles so fine they were nearly invisible to the naked eye, and my afternoons in university laboratories studying the molecular structure of synthetic fibers and the chemical properties of sustainable polymers. I wasn't just learning how to sew anymore. I was learning how to re-engineer the very DNA of the fashion industry, moving beyond the superficiality of style to the rigorous physics of performance and environmental impact. My obsession was no longer just a hobby or a means of escape. It had become a calculated technical assault on an industry that had historically prioritized profit over the planet. In the fourth year of this grueling grind, after thousands of hours of experimentation with recycled polymers and high-tensile organic filaments, I finally achieved a breakthrough that would change everything. I developed and patented a revolutionary carbon-neutral weaving process, officially registered as patent number 9,842,105. This wasn't a simple tweak to existing technology, but a complete overhaul of the mechanical tension and thermal bonding used in industrial looms, allowing for the creation of ultra-luxury textiles that required zero petrochemical inputs. To protect this intellectual property from the predatory vultures of the corporate world, I took the last of my hard-earned savings and hired Sarah Jenkins, a top-tier intellectual property attorney whose office on the 44th floor of a glass tower in Midtown smelled like expensive mahogany, aged leather, and $9 a cup artisanal espresso. Sarah was a woman who spoke in the precise, legalistic shorthand of a person who billed $600 for a 15-minute phone call, and she looked at my patent with the hungry intensity of a shark scenting blood in the water. Together, we navigated the labyrinthine world of international patent law, ensuring that my technology was shielded by a fortress of legal protections that not even my father's prestigious firm could penetrate. The turning point came when Sarah and I secured an exclusive, high-stakes contract with the most famous fashion house in Paris, a legacy brand that had spent a century defining elegance but was currently struggling to modernize its production line. They didn't care about the Miller name or my sister's social standing. They cared about the fact that I held the keys to the most sustainable and technologically advanced textile production in the world. However, I made the conscious and strategic decision to keep my real identity buried deep beneath layers of corporate bureaucracy, using the professional alias CM Designs for all public-facing documents and press releases. I had no interest in the hollow fame that Brianna so desperately craved, or the social validation that my parents had used to measure my worth for 29 years. While they were busy maintaining the illusion of their status in the dwindling circles of Scarsdale, I was building a shadow empire, watching my bank account grow from that original $4.12 to a steady $2.4 million in liquid assets, held in diversified accounts that allowed me to move through the world with a quiet, invisible power. My daily existence during these years was a study in extreme contrast, as I spent my mornings in grease-stained industrial warehouses in New Jersey, overseeing the calibration of my patented looms, and my evenings in hushed, high-stakes negotiations via encrypted video calls with European executives. I learned the precise chemistry of non-toxic vat dyes and the exact atmospheric conditions required to maintain the structural integrity of bioengineered silk, becoming as much a scientist as I was a designer. My hands, once calloused from the $15 Singer machine, were now accustomed to the haptic feedback of million-dollar computerized weaving systems that could produce fabric so light it felt like a second skin, yet so durable it could withstand hundreds of pounds of pressure per square inch. I lived on black coffee from the bodega on the corner and $3 street tacos, pouring every single cent of my profit back into research and development, driven by a cold, clinical fire that the Millers could never understand. I was no longer the girl who had her favorite blouse burned in a driveway. I was the architect of a new industrial revolution, and every dollar I earned was a brick in the wall I was building between myself and the people who had tried to make me feel small. The psychological landscape of my life shifted as my financial security solidified, moving from the frantic survivalism of my early Brooklyn days to a state of calm, tactical preparedness. I began to view the world through the lens of supply chains and material durability, realizing that the luxury items my mother and sister obsessed over were actually fragile, poorly constructed artifacts compared to the textiles I was creating. I would often walk through the high-end department stores of Fifth Avenue wearing a simple, unbranded charcoal gray hoodie made from my own carbon-neutral blend and smile as I watched women like Brianna pay thousands of dollars for garments that were technically inferior to the samples sitting in my lab. They were buying the label, but I owned the substance, and there was a profound, almost addictive satisfaction in knowing that the very foundations of their world were becoming dependent on a technology that bore my initials in a secret registry. Sarah Jenkins often told me that I was the most disciplined client she had ever represented, a woman who treated her millions not as a trophy, but as ammunition for a larger battle that was yet to be fought. Throughout this 7-year ascent, the memories of the Pelham Country Club acted as a constant, stabilizing force, a reminder of the absolute bankruptcy of the life I had left behind. Whenever I felt the exhaustion deep in my marrow after a 20-hour shift, I would think of the cold, sticky sensation of the Veuve Clicquot on my back and the way my mother had looked at me as if I were a stain on her reputation. I realized that my success was the ultimate form of technical correction. I was proving that the garbage girl was, in fact, the most valuable asset the Miller family had ever possessed, even if they were too blind to recognize it. My $2.4 million in liquid assets was a testament to the fact that talent and technical expertise are the only currencies that truly matter in a world obsessed with appearances. I had replaced my sister's white BMW with a global patent portfolio and my parents' $8,400 lawn with a contract that dictated the future of Parisian haute couture. I was CM Designs, a ghost in the machine of the fashion world, and I was finally ready to step out of the shadows and let the Millers see exactly what kind of fire they had started when they lit that match in the driveway. The process of building my company was an exercise in extreme detail, from the specific micron count of the fibers to the exact torque of the spindles in the manufacturing plant I eventually leased in upstate New York. I knew the name of every technician on my floor and the exact boiling point of every polymer we synthesized, maintaining a level of oversight that bordered on the fanatical. I didn't have a social life, I didn't have a partner, and I certainly didn't have a relationship with the people in Scarsdale, who I assumed were still living their lives in a state of high-gloss stagnation. My only companions were the rhythmic thrum of the machinery and the steady, upward climb of the numbers on my financial dashboard, a digital heartbeat that signaled my growing independence. By the end of the 7 years, I had transformed myself from a discarded daughter into a powerhouse of industrial innovation, and I had done it all without a single word of encouragement from the people whose name I still carried. I was a self-made woman in the most literal sense of the word, having woven my own safety net out of the very materials that the world had deemed worthless. As I sat in Sarah Jenkins' office one final time before the public launch of my partnership with the French fashion house, looking out at the sprawling, chaotic beauty of the New York skyline, I felt a sense of completion that no designer bag or country club membership could ever provide. I was 36 years old, I was a millionaire several times over, and I was the undisputed leader in my field, possessing a level of technical mastery that few in history had ever achieved. I looked at the black ballpoint pen on Sarah's mahogany desk, the same kind of pen I had used to draw that grid on a Dunkin' Donuts napkin 7 years ago, and I realized that the distance I had traveled couldn't be measured in miles, but in the sheer density of my resolve. The Miller family was a small, fading dot in my rearview mirror, a collection of people who valued the dress more than the woman wearing it, and I was finally ready to show them that the woman they had thrown away was now the one who decided what the rest of the world would wear. The $4.12 was gone, replaced by a fortune built on the integrity of the weave and the precision of the stitch. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving in a world of my own magnificent and meticulous design. My talent had paid for far more than a studio in Brooklyn. It had purchased me a seat at the head of a table they weren't even invited to, and the silence of my anonymity was about to be broken by the deafening sound of my success. Last month, the event the industry dubbed the Gala of the Century took place beneath the soaring, vaulted ceilings of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, a night where the air was thick with the scent of $500 floral arrangements and the desperate, cloying ambition of the New York elite. There were 450 guests in attendance, each having paid a minimum of $2,500 for a seat at the linen-draped tables, all vying for a moment of relevance in a room where the net worth of the occupants exceeded the GDP of some small nations. Among them was Brianna, now 39 and clutching her social status with the white-knuckled desperation of a woman who realizes her youth is no longer her primary currency. She was there, moving through the crowd like a shark in shallow water, desperately trying to climb the final rungs of the social ladder that had always seemed just out of her reach, despite our father's senior partnership. I watched from the shadows of the Egyptian wing as she held court with a group of influential socialites, her voice rising in that performative, high-pitched trill she reserved for people she wanted to impress. She was wearing a dress that was a blatant, poorly executed knockoff of a CM Designs gown, a garment that mimicked the silhouette of my early work, but lacked the structural integrity and the molecularly precise drape of my authentic pieces. It was a pathetic imitation made of a cheap polyester blend that caught the light in all the wrong ways. Yet she was bragging to anyone who would listen that she was best friends with the designer, spinning a web of lies about our supposed intimate brunch dates and shared secrets. What Brianna didn't know, and what my parents sitting beside her in their stiff tuxedo and overbearing pearls couldn't possibly fathom, was that I had personally bought the sponsorship for their entire table through one of my shell corporations for the sole purpose of witnessing the exact moment the floor fell out from beneath them. I had orchestrated every detail of my entrance with the same mathematical precision I used to calibrate my patented looms, ensuring that the lighting, the timing, and the optics were all optimized for maximum impact. I walked into the Great Hall wearing a custom-made midnight blue gown crafted from my latest laboratory breakthrough, a fabric I had dubbed shadow silk, which possessed a refractive index that made it appear to absorb the very light around it before releasing it in a soft, ethereal glow. The total cost of my outfit was technically $0 because I had spun the fibers, woven the textile, and hand-stitched the seams in my private laboratory, but the market value of the garment, given its one-of-a-kind technological composition and the CM Designs label, was appraised at $85,000. As I moved across the marble floor, the fabric didn't rustle like cheap satin. It moved with a silent, liquid grace that made the surrounding designer gowns look like stiff cardboard. My name had not been on the public guest list, but my presence was the gravity around which the entire room began to shift, a technical correction to a narrative that had been skewed for far too long. I approached their table with a measured, deliberate pace, my heels clicking on the stone with a sound that felt like the countdown to an explosion. My father, Marcus, was mid-sentence, likely regaling a bored venture capitalist with a story about his firm's recent litigation successes, while my mother, Evelyn, was adjusting her diamond necklace with a practiced, hollow smile. When they saw me, the air seemed to vanish from their immediate vicinity, their faces transitioning from a state of haughty indifference to a mask of sheer, unadulterated shock. They didn't see the garbage girl from the Scarsdale attic. They saw the woman the New York Times had recently called the most powerful invisible force in global textiles. Brianna's mouth went slack, her glass of champagne trembling in her hand as she looked at my dress, her trained eye finally recognizing the difference between her $200 counterfeit and the $85,000 masterpiece I was wearing. The silence at the table was heavy and clinical, a vacuum created by the sudden collapse of their perceived superiority. I didn't wait for them to speak, nor did I offer a polite greeting to bridge the 7-year chasm of their silence. I simply stood there, a living embodiment of the talent they had tried to burn and the success they had tried to dismiss as impossible. The irony of the moment was almost too dense to breathe. Brianna had spent the last hour claiming to be the confidant of CM Designs, and now the designer was standing in front of her, draped in a fabric that her mind couldn't even begin to comprehend. I watched the gears turning behind her eyes as she tried to reconcile the sister she had humiliated at the Pelham Country Club with the titan standing before her in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. My mother's hand went to her throat, her fingers tracing the pearls that had once been the symbol of her dominance over me, but which now looked like dim, dusty trinkets compared to the radiant technology of my gown. My father looked at me with a mixture of fear and a sudden, sickening kind of greed, the look a man gives a high-value asset he accidentally let slip through his fingers. I could see him calculating the potential billable hours and the social capital my return could bring him, but I also saw the realization that I was now entirely beyond his jurisdiction. I was no longer a daughter to be managed or a disappointment to be hidden. I was a sovereign entity with a net worth that made his senior partnership look like an entry-level position. The gown I wore was more than just a piece of clothing. It was a physical manifestation of my 7-year exile and my subsequent triumph over their limitations. The shadow silk was composed of a carbon nanotube-infused protein structure that I had spent 3 years perfecting, a material that was technically 10 times stronger than steel while remaining as soft as a cloud. Every stitch was a testament to the thousands of hours I had spent in the Dunkin' Donuts, the Brooklyn studio, and the New Jersey warehouses, turning their rejection into the fuel for my innovation. As the socialites around the table began to realize who I was, the whispers started to spread through the hall like a wildfire, the name Cassidy Miller finally being linked to the CM Designs brand in a public, irreversible way. I didn't need to say a word to expose Brianna's lies. The contrast between her knockoff and my original said everything that needed to be said about the integrity of the Miller family. They were the ones who looked like an embarrassment now, sitting at a table paid for by the very person they had told to change into a waitress's uniform. The financial reality of the situation was the final, sharpest needle in the cushion of their pride. They had spent their lives measuring worth in dollars and cents, in the cost of lawn maintenance and the price of country club memberships, and I had just walked in with more liquid capital in my checking account than the entire value of their Scarsdale estate. I had used my talent to build a fortress of independence that they couldn't even dream of breaching. I saw my father's eyes scan the room, looking for a way to spin this into a victory for the family brand. But he found nothing but the cold, hard facts of my autonomy. I was the one who had secured the Parisian contracts. I was the one who held the patents, and I was the one who decided who got a seat at the table. The power dynamic had been completely and permanently inverted, and the look on Brianna's face as she realized she was wearing a fake version of her sister's soul was a masterpiece of poetic justice that no amount of money could ever buy. I reached out and picked up a grape from a silver bowl on their table, the movement of my arm causing the shadow silk to ripple like a deep sea wave. I looked at Brianna, really looked at her, and saw the smallness of her world, the way her entire identity was built on the shaky foundation of other people's approval. I, on the other hand, had built my identity on the molecular stability of my own work. I smiled, a small, clinical smile that didn't reach my eyes, and I could see her flinch as if I had struck her. There was no need for a dramatic confrontation or a tearful reconciliation. The facts spoke for themselves. I was the lead textile engineer for a global conglomerate, the owner of a multi-million-dollar patent portfolio, and the woman who was currently sponsoring their presence at the most exclusive event of the year. I had taken the $4.12 they had left me with and turned it into an empire, while they had stayed exactly where they were, polishing the same old brass and calling it gold. The gala continued around us, the music of the orchestra swelling as the first course was served, but for the Millers, the night was over. They sat in the middle of the most prestigious room in the city, surrounded by the elite they had spent their lives chasing, and they had never been more invisible. I had erased their influence with a single midnight blue gown and a 7-year silence that was now deafening. As I turned to walk away, heading toward the podium where I was scheduled to give the keynote address on the future of sustainable luxury, I felt the final thread of our connection snap. It wasn't a painful break. It was a clean, surgical cut. I left them there at the table I had bought for them, trapped in the cage of their own making, wearing their synthetic blends and their manufactured smiles. I walked into the light of the cameras, the shadow silk glowing with a power all its own, ready to tell the world a story that didn't include the word garbage girl. My life was no longer a reaction to their cruelty. It was a testament to my own technical excellence, and as I looked out at the sea of faces waiting to hear me speak, I knew that the only image that mattered was the one I had built with my own 2 hands. The Miller family was a footnote in a much larger, more resilient narrative, and I was finally the one holding the pen, the needle, and the future. The moral of my story is a simple, technical truth. The quality of the fiber determines the strength of the fabric, and no amount of expensive dye can hide a weak weave for long. My family tried to treat me like a scrap of waste, but in doing so, they only proved that they didn't understand the materials they were working with. They focused on the price tag while I focused on the tensile strength, and in the end, the substance always outlasts the label. Family isn't the people who share your blood. It's the people who recognize your value when you have nothing but $4.12 in your pocket and a ruined dress on your back. It is the Sarah Jenkinses of the world who see the potential in your patents and the technicians who help you realize your vision in a grease-stained warehouse. I have built a new family out of integrity, labor, and mutual respect, a structure that is far more durable than the colonial house in Scarsdale. As I stand here today, I am not just a survivor of a toxic family. I am the architect of a new reality where beauty is engineered and worth is earned. The fire they started in that driveway didn't destroy me. It only tempered the steel in my soul, allowing me to weave a life that is as unbreakable as the silk I created. And as for the Millers, they are welcome to keep their $8,400 lawns and their knockoff gowns. I have the entire world to redesign, and I am only just getting started on the first layer. The heavy velvet curtains of the Metropolitan Museum of Art's makeshift stage seem to absorb the collective breath of the 450 guests as the gala host stepped toward the mahogany podium at exactly 9:12 p.m. The lighting in the Great Hall had been dimmed to a dramatic amber hue, highlighting the intricate stonework of the Temple of Dender and casting long cinematic shadows across the faces of the New York elite. We are honored to welcome the visionary behind this evening's theme, the woman whose technical breakthroughs have redefined the very fabric of our industry and the winner of this year's Global Innovation Award, the host announced, his voice amplified by a state-of-the-art Bose sound system that made the words resonate in the hollow of one's chest. Cassidy Miller. The silence that followed was not merely a lack of noise, it was a physical weight, a sudden vacuum of sound so absolute that the mechanical hum of the building's climate control system became audible. In that vacuum, a sharp metallic ring cut through the air, the sound of a silver crystal fork slipping from Brianna's trembling fingers and hitting her gold-rimmed porcelain dinner plate with a jarring, discordant clatter. I didn't need to look at her to know that her jaw had literally dropped, her carefully applied designer lipstick now framing a mouth frozen in an expression of pure, unadulterated shock as she realized the sister she had spent a lifetime belittling was the Titan. The entire room was standing to applaud. I walked to the podium with a calm, predatory grace, the midnight blue shadow silk of my $85,000 gown shifting around my legs like liquid ink, its proprietary weave catching the spotlight and reflecting a soft, pulsating glow that made me appear to be radiating my own light. As I reached the microphone, I didn't look at the cameras or the famous actors in the front row. Instead, my gaze locked onto the third row, where Marcus and Evelyn Miller sat like statues carved from ice. My father's face, usually a mask of litigious confidence, was a sickly shade of gray, his eyes wide and vacant, as if he were watching his entire worldview spontaneously deconstruct. I reached into the hidden, silk-lined pocket of my gown and pulled out a standard manila folder, its mundane, utilitarian appearance a deliberate contrast to the high-gloss luxury surrounding us. I opened it with a crisp, decisive snap that echoed through the microphone, revealing a single, high-resolution document printed on heavy bond paper. I would like to make a public donation tonight to the Youth Arts Fund in the amount of exactly $112,320, I stated, my voice steady, amplified and devoid of the tremors that used to plague me in the Scarsdale house. I paused, letting the specific, idiosyncratic number hang in the air like a mathematical indictment as the guests leaned forward in their seats, sensing the weight of a hidden history being unveiled. That specific figure is not arbitrary. It represents every single cent, adjusted for inflation, that my parents spent on Brianna's elite private education, her violin tutors, and her Ivy League prep courses, while simultaneously telling me that I wasn't worth the investment of a single sewing class. I continued, the words landing with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. I saw my mother's hand fly to her mouth, her eyes darting around the room as she realized that the private shames of our household were being transformed into a public legacy of their failure. I stepped down from the stage, the light following me like a loyal shadow, and walked directly toward the third row until I was standing inches away from the man who had once dropped $100 bill in a driveway as a pittance for my burned soul. I reached out and handed a certified copy of the bank transfer, stamped with the official seal of my corporate treasury, directly to my father, whose fingers were too numb to initially grasp the paper. His hand shook as he took the document, his eyes scanning the numbers that quantified my success and his own obsolescence in one fell swoop. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost, or perhaps more accurately, like a man who realized he had spent 30 years haunted by a daughter he never actually knew. The document didn't just represent a donation, it was a receipt for my freedom, a formal declaration that the debt of my upbringing had been paid in full, with interest, and that the Miller family had no further claim on my identity or my future. I watched as he looked from the paper to my face, searching for a flicker of the old Cassidy, the girl who would have flinched at his glare, but he found only the lead textile engineer of a global empire, a woman whose internal weave was now far stronger than anything he could hope to tear. The guests at the surrounding tables, including the socialites Brianna had been lying to just minutes prior, watched the exchange with a mixture of horror and fascination, their social barometers recalibrating in real time. Brianna sat slumped in her chair, the cheap polyester of her knockoff gown suddenly looking like the costume of a fraud, her eyes brimming with the tears of a golden child who realizes the gold was only ever a thin, peeling plating. The contrast between her manufactured life and my engineered reality was now a matter of public record, a technical truth that could never be retracted or litigated away. I turned back to the room, leaving my father staring at the transfer of funds as if it were a death warrant for his social standing, and I felt a profound sense of closure that settled into my bones like the final stitch in a complex pattern. I had not sought revenge in the traditional sense. I had sought a technical correction, a rebalancing of a ledger that had been skewed toward injustice since the day I was born. As I returned to the microphone to finish my address, I felt the immense weight of the Metropolitan Museum's history pressing down on me, but it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a foundation. I spoke to the audience about the molecular resilience of textiles, about how the most discarded materials can be transformed into the most valuable assets through the application of science and the persistence of the human spirit. I told them that the future of luxury wasn't in the brand or the heritage, but in the integrity of the process and the worth of the hands that do the work. While I spoke, I could see the socialites at the Miller table shifting their chairs away from Brianna and my parents, a subtle but devastating realignment of the social fabric that left my family stranded on a literal and metaphorical island in the middle of the Great Hall. They had spent $8,400 a year on lawn maintenance to look better than their neighbors. But tonight, they looked like the only weeds in a garden of magnificent achievement. The moral of this final chapter is that the truth has a specific gravity that eventually pulls all lies to the ground, no matter how much they cost to maintain. My parents believed they were saving money by not investing in me, but in reality, they were divesting from the only part of their legacy that had the structural integrity to survive the test of time. They chose the synthetic over the natural, the appearance over the substance, and the favorite over the faithful. by handing my father that bank transfer of $112,320. I wasn't just giving money to a charity. I was purchasing the final remains of their power over me and handing it back to them in a form they could understand. A cold, hard, financial transaction. I walked off that stage not as a daughter seeking approval, but as an innovator who had outpaced her creators, leaving them behind in a world of 2004 Dom Perignon and 3,200 square foot illusions. The night ended with a standing ovation that lasted for 3 full minutes, a sound like a rushing tide that washed away the last lingering echoes of my sister's voice, calling me a walking embarrassment. As I left the museum, walking past the 2024 Chevrolet Tahoes and the sleek black town cars, I saw my family standing on the sidewalk, waiting for a valet who seemed to be taking an eternity to find their white BMW. They looked small against the backdrop of the Fifth Avenue skyline, like discarded remnants of a fashion season that had long since passed. I stepped into my own car, the door closing with a solid, pressurized thud that silenced the city, and I looked at my hands in the dim interior light. They were the same hands that had sewn on a $15 Singer machine and scavenged for silk in dusty basements, but now they held the blueprints for the future. Family isn't who pays for your school. Family is the person who builds a school for others because they know what it's like to be left in the dark. I drove away into the New York night, the midnight blue of my gown blending with the shadows of the city. Finally, beautifully, and technically complete. I knew as the lights of the city blurred past my window that the Miller name would eventually fade from the social registries of Scarsdale and the legal circles of Manhattan, replaced by the enduring carbon-neutral legacy of CM Designs. I had taken the ash of my childhood and turned it into the diamond of my career, proving once and for all that the garbage girl was the only one who truly understood how to build something that lasts. My father would keep that bank transfer document, perhaps framing it or hiding it in a drawer, but it would always serve as a reminder that his greatest failure was his inability to recognize his greatest success. I was Cassidy Miller, lead textile engineer, a woman woven from resilience and stitched together with the threads of my own making, and for the first time in 36 years, the fabric of my life was perfect. I didn't need a seat at their table because I had built the entire room, and as the sun began to hint at the horizon, I realized that the only thing more priceless than the shame they tried to give me was the absolute, unshakable silence of my triumph. The fallout from that night at the Metropolitan Museum of Art was as surgical and cold as a laser cutting through a sheet of high-performance carbon fiber. I didn't have to lift another finger or say another word, because the truth, once exposed to the high-pressure environment of the New York elite, began to dissolve the Miller family's reputation with a terrifying chemical efficiency. Within 48 hours of my speech, my father's prestigious law firm, sensitive to even the slightest whisper of scandal or financial impropriety, initiated an internal audit of the Miller household's finances after my public disclosure of the exact dollar amount spent on Brianna's education. What they discovered was far more damaging than mere favoritism. They uncovered a labyrinth of irregularities and mounting liabilities that Brianna had been frantically hiding behind a veneer of Lululemon and Aritzia shopping bags. My sister, in her desperate bid to maintain the illusion of a golden lifestyle, had accumulated over $67,000 in secret, unpaid luxury credit card debt, much of it funneled through secondary accounts that she had improperly linked to my father's corporate line of credit. The firm's ethics committee viewed this not just as a family matter, but as a catastrophic lapse in judgment for a senior partner, and Marcus Miller was quietly asked to take an indefinite leave of absence, his mahogany office packed into boxes by subordinates who had once trembled at the sound of his voice. As their world began to fray at the seams, the frantic calls and the deluge of manipulative text messages began. But I was already gone, having moved into a digital fortress as impenetrable as the laboratory where I developed my patents. I blocked every single one of their numbers, The silence that followed feeling like the clean, pressurized air of a clean room after a lifetime of breathing in the acrid smoke of their judgment. I set a permanent auto-reply on my professional and personal email accounts, a short, clinical statement that read, "For all inquiries, legal, financial, or personal, please contact my representatives at the law offices of Sarah Jenkins and Associates." I didn't want their apologies, which I knew were just veiled attempts to access my liquid assets, and I didn't want their explanations, because a textile engineer knows that a fundamental flaw in the weave cannot be fixed by simply re-dyeing the surface. My mother tried to reach me through an old college friend, claiming she was heartbroken and that she had always believed in my talent. But I knew the molecular weight of her lies. She hadn't believed in me when I was sewing in the attic with a $15 Singer, and she certainly didn't believe in me when she told me to put on a waitress's uniform to save her social standing. She only believed in the $2.4 million and the Global Innovation Award that now bore my name. Today, I live in a 2,800-square-foot industrial loft in a converted textile mill, a space defined by floor-to-ceiling windows that offer a panoramic, unobstructed view of the Manhattan skyline I once looked at from a Dunkin' Donuts window. The interior is a study in hyper-realism and technical precision, featuring polished concrete floors, exposed steel beams, and furniture upholstered in the very shadow silk fabrics that made me a fortune. There are no $8,400 lawns here, no manicured boxwoods, and no mahogany staircases built on the backs of unloved children. Every morning at exactly 7:00 a.m., the automated Lutron shades rise silently to greet the sun, and I stand by the window with a cup of black coffee, watching the city below begin its daily grind. I look at my reflection in the glass, and I don't see a daughter or a sister. I see a lead textile engineer who built a world out of the scraps that others were too arrogant to value. I remember the girl in the $4.50 thrift store blouse, the girl who stood in a driveway and watched her favorite Christian Dior original turn into black ash, and I feel a profound sense of gratitude for the fire that Marcus and Vanessa Miller started. They thought they were burning my spirit, but they were actually performing the ultimate stress test, proving that I was composed of a material that only grows stronger under heat and pressure. The contrast between my life now and the hollow existence I left behind in Scarsdale is the difference between a high-tensile synthetic polymer and a piece of rotting cotton. I have filled my life with people who understand the physics of loyalty and the chemistry of respect, colleagues who value my mind and friends who wouldn't dream of spilling champagne on my accomplishments. My bank account continues to grow. My patents are being integrated into the production lines of every major fashion house from Milan to Tokyo, and my name is spoken with reverence in the laboratories where the future of the world is being woven. I am the architect of my own identity, the master of my own loom, and the only person who decides the specifications of my happiness. The Miller family is a closed file, a discarded prototype, a lesson in the dangers of prioritizing the label over the fiber, and I no longer carry the weight of their expectations in the weave of my soul. Standing in the quiet luxury of my loft, I realize that family isn't a biological mandate. It is a structural choice. We are told from birth that blood is the strongest bond, but any engineer will tell you that the strongest bonds are the ones we create intentionally through chemistry and heat. My family chose to divest from me, and in doing so, they gave me the capital to invest in myself, a transaction that has yielded the greatest possible return. I look at the black ballpoint pen sitting on my marble countertop, the same model I used to draw my first grid of survival, and I am reminded that the most powerful thing you can ever own is the truth of your own worth. I am Cassidy Miller, and I am no longer an embarrassment, a disappointment, or a garbage girl. I am a visionary, a millionaire, and a woman who knows exactly how much it costs to build a life of integrity. The $4.12 that I once held so tightly in my hand has become an empire of innovation, and the silence of my loft is the most beautiful sound I have ever heard, the sound of a life that is finally, perfectly, and technically my own, The moral of this journey is that you must be willing to let go of the threads that are pulling you apart if you ever want to weave yourself back together. We often hold on to toxic family members because we are afraid of the holes they will leave behind, forgetting that those holes are the very spaces where our own strength can finally grow. I had to become an orphan in my own mind to become a leader in my own life, cutting the ties of biology to find the ties of character. My parents and Brianna were the flaws in my fabric, the loose ends that threatened the integrity of the whole, and by removing them, I didn't lose my family. I saved my future. True wealth isn't found in a law firm partnership or a white BMW. It is found in the ability to look at your own work and know that it is good, that it is real, and that it belongs to you. As the sun climbs higher over the city, illuminating the complex, beautiful weave of the world I helped create, I take a final sip of my coffee and turn toward my laboratory, ready to start the next project, knowing that the only thing more durable than my shadow silk is the woman who engineered it. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and today, the only person standing at the head of my table is the only one who ever truly belonged there. Me.